Up on stage. Thank you so much, Charlene. I know that we didn't have a lot of time for questions, but Charlene will be available at the end of the day, as will most of our team. So we, in the spirit of these future discussions, look at how I'm going to cuss right now. Badass these ladies are. They're coming up without any notes or slides. We are going to tee up the next discussion. We've been talking a lot about the future state of data and science and everything that's happening in our world in rare disease, and these amazing women, moderated and led by Wendy, who we all heard yesterday, will tee up this really insightful conversation about kind of the how and why we can embrace all those opportunities in front of us. One thing, hi to everyone that's virtual. We forgot to do this yesterday, and we know that we have a virtual audience, so thank you guys for joining virtually, and hopefully next year you'll be able to join us. So without further ado, amazing ladies.
Thanks, Nicole. It might be the first time in my entire life I've been called a badass. So that was worth the trip alone. We're really excited to be here, and I think if we could all just give Charlene a quick round of applause. The amount of work that's been accomplished by a shockingly short period of time. Data's complex, and starting something from the ground up is complex. And what's behind those slides is an incredible amount of work and future impact. So Charlene, thanks for that update. We're each going to introduce ourselves a little bit, and then our goal of this session is to kind of bring it all to life of why this matters and what takeaways everyone needs to take from the rest of the sessions today. So I lead patient experience at Alexion. We're a rare disease drug development company. I've been working in rare disease for most of my career, and what that means to me is I have the incredible privilege of meeting, engaging, getting to know, and quite frankly, becoming deeply connected to people in the rare disease community. So this is my career and my profession, but more importantly, it's just what I do and who I am. And I've met a lot of you through this journey, and I really appreciate you letting me into your world. Betsy?
Thanks. Betsy Bogard. I work in the development of transformative medicines, particularly for rare diseases that have little or no treatment options. I'm currently at Ensoma, a privately funded biotech developing in vivo gene therapy for cancer and rare diseases. And I've also worked in the nonprofit sector to enable the development of therapies from the patient group perspective. And I have a personal connection to rare diseases. My little brother lived with the rare disease fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva till this past January. He was 45. And I'm excited to be here for our conversation.
Thank you. We'll learn a little bit more about Betsy's journey and her brother in this session.
Thanks for everyone. I don't know if we need to turn this on. Sorry, I wasn't allowed to have a clip, so I've got to have... Can you hear me okay? No, you can't, okay. My name is Julia Vitarello. I entered this world 6 years ago. It's hard to imagine. When my daughter Mila was diagnosed with a rare form of an already very rare disease, Batten disease, first thing that I did was come to the Global Genes Conference, which I just came off of this week. The last time I came was 5 years ago, and that was my intro into this world, and I felt completely alone, and then realized that I was fortunately or unfortunately one of millions. And I'm really honored to be here to talk about something that is really important, and I've never wanted to have to deal with data because I didn't understand it. And I remember 2.5 years ago when Nicole and I were talking and RareX was just getting going, and we were like, 4 drinks in, and I remember leaving and being like, I have no idea what just happened, but I know that data is really, really important to make these treatments happen, and I better start learning. So here we are now, and it's grown to such an incredible place. So thanks for having me as part of this discussion, and as many of you know, I lost my daughter last year, so I am here today for no other reason because if we don't, all of us, and that's not just industry and academics, but as we've learned, it's patients and it's parents of patients. If we don't all add the sense of urgency and the sense of thinking outside the box, because the current way is not cutting it, and you guys are doing a great job at bringing us together as kind of a third player in this scene. So thanks.
Julia, thank you so much, and Mila's here with us. because her spirit's going to really guide this conversation, and along with Betsy's brother. So if everybody just pauses for a minute and thinks about why we need to do this and why we need to do it together, this is why. We're going to, as I said, really try to bring this to life and give some examples. And Julia, let's start with you, because you mentioned, you know, nobody raises their hand and says, I want a rare disease journey. And that's where you found yourself, and you immediately realized you were going to have to blaze a trail on your own. But you also shared a couple years into your journey, you still didn't want to talk about data. So what was that transition like, and for you personally, and then how did you navigate what you needed to learn about data and why it matters?
That's a good question. I initially started by fighting for Mila, like many of you. So I saw my daughter, who had been previously completely seemingly healthy and outgoing and skiing and rock climbing and doing all the things that little kids in Colorado do. That's how I became a mom, was just like an average person. And then suddenly my daughter, in just a period of 1 year, practically lost her vision completely and her ability to walk and, you know, talk, and pretty much, you know, was declining in front of me by the month. I don't want to go into details, we don't have a lot of time, but I think a lot of you know the story that Mila ended up becoming the first person to receive a drug tailored to one person. That's not what I set out to do. I just set out to try to save my daughter. And it went from Batten focused to suddenly, once Mila was treated, realizing together with Dr. Tim Yu from Boston Children's, who designed and pioneered this drug, that this was potentially a platform solution that could solve what I would like to continue calling a global health crisis, which is rare disease. And never sure why people don't call it that, because it's bigger, as we've learned, than, you know, HIV and AIDS and cancer combined. And so a platform solution is needed, and I started learning that this was potentially going to be an impactful solution to this. And one of the ways to get there was going to be to start with Mila's data, her preclinical and clinical data around Milacin, her drug, and also all the data around the actual process itself of how do we create individualized medicines that hadn't been done before. And so I just realized that if we don't start somewhere and collect this data and start collecting every data, you know, instead of having siloed data for each individual patient and each individual disease, we have to put it in a place where we can have learnings. And unfortunately, data sits in drawers of academics, often, not always, and it sits behind closed doors of companies, unfortunately. And so one of the things that will be discussed, I'll discuss it in this panel a little bit, and then Winston Yan, who runs the NF1 collaborative that I helped start last year with Tim Yu and many others, is a great place to have a neutral hub exactly for that. So the center of that is starting with Mila's data, is collecting data in a transparent way that is available for everyone so that we can scale this. Otherwise, we're going to be here in these orange chairs in like 2,000 years still talking about how we're going to solve rare disease. So hope that answers that question.
Thank you. Betsy, let's pull this thread through a little bit more and start with your experience in the FOP community. We throw the term data around. I think that's a really big word. What does that mean, and how can we sort of bring that down to, you know, the kernels of what is really important when we talk about data, and what was your experience in the FOP community?
That's a great question. I wasn't expecting that one. I think the data are anything that you need to generate along the way, from the journey from discovery of compounds and engaging investors in that early process of choosing what disease they want to work on, all the way through to market access and reimbursement by payers. I think of it around the data about patients and how they live, what a disease means for them, how it impacts them, what life is like every day with a disease. And I think that's an area where patient organizations have a particularly important and valuable and difficult opportunity to make a difference, to develop those data sets that describe a disease. It's such a great opportunity for a patient community to do versus a developer or an academic entity.
So let's talk about your advocacy experience and how you connected the two in bringing data to the forefront.
Yeah, well, and maybe, like, I guess one general point of perspective I'll offer on the FOP community. The FOP community has 900 known patients worldwide, which to people working on N of 1 therapies probably sounds gigantic. But of course, in the standard measures of therapeutic development and pharmaceutical companies making decisions about where they're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to make a therapy possible, it's tiny. And it's you, on first glance, would think it doesn't rank in the eyes of a pharmaceutical company. But right now, the FOP community has 9 compounds in registered clinical trials being conducted by 6 different companies, from small biotech to big ones. Another 4 in preclinical development. I think there's over 10 companies working with known compounds working on FOP, and many more in discovery. And that's just an astounding breadth of activity for such a tiny community. And it's possible because of all of the tools that the patient community with the clinicians and with the researchers have put into place. And data is a huge piece of that. It's all the tools that we know. It's providing animal models and having a biobank and funding forums and funding research, but it's also the data. And so the FOP community has a registry, and I hope it's a growing part of therapeutic development. And I think there's a lot more to do in the rare disease community to make those kinds of registries and data sets really impactful in therapeutic development.
And accessible.
And accessible. So right, a big piece of a patient community having a role in those kinds of data sets is to make them more accessible to all of the people that want to work on them. And also to make sure that there is a holistic view of a disease that's being provided. When individual developers or companies create these data sets about a disease, they can somewhat unintentionally bring a bias, a focus on their therapeutic modality. If you're developing a protein that only treats systemic manifestations of a disease, your data set might not really adequately capture the CNS manifestations of a disease. So having a patient community drive data collection around what it's like to live with a disease has the potential to make the data more accessible. You talked about data being locked up by academic researchers. In some of my work in real-world evidence and industry, we've tried to access data sets from academic researchers, and it can take a year or more just to get a contract in place to get the data, and that's way too long if you're trying to answer a question about a clinical trial that has emergent data. So being able to create access to data sets quickly and being able to provide a holistic view of a disease is just a huge opportunity for patient communities.
So we heard a little bit about N of 1, a little bit about an ultra-rare community, and I wanted to share one experience I had working in a bigger neurodegenerative disease, ALS. And at my company, we had a drug that was approved and had really important data in different neurological conditions. And so we had a concept that we could look at this medicine in ALS. And the team started going down kind of the normal path of phase 1B, 2A study, and how can we accelerate this? Because of the data available in the community, the natural history data, the real world evidence, the burden of disease, and quite frankly, a swimming pool of data from failed trials, we very quickly, working in partnership with the community, had an idea to go direct to a phase 3. So we knew the safety profile of this medicine, but it had never been studied in ALS before. And going direct to phase 3 required a significant amount of engagement with the community at large, with regulators. It's a unique proposition. It was because of the data sets that had been built, including research that wasn't successful over a long period of time. And by going direct to phase 3, we were able to execute a robust, global, scientifically rigorous study in an astoundingly short amount of time. It was a little bit over a year during COVID. So that example is meant to illustrate the power of the patient community coming to the table with data. I'll be candid and transparent. The drug didn't work. So this isn't a story of this was a hugely successful, positive clinical outcome, but it was an incredibly important way to ask questions and answer questions in this community from a rigorous scientific perspective because of the wealth of data. Julia, you talked about working specifically with a physician at Boston Children's. How did that relationship come about, and then how is that work connecting to drug development and industry now?
Well, it came about because of social media and my desperate plea after Mila was diagnosed and given only half of a diagnosis. I went on social media and looked for whole genome sequencing, which 6 years ago at the time was pretty much impossible to find. And if I could, it would take 5 months, which would be not acceptable for Mila's rapid decline. And so Dr. Yu at Boston Children's was incredibly kind to reach out and say, hey, from a research point of view, we'd love to find out more about Mila's mutation. And by doing that, that ended up not only leading to a confirmation of Mila's diagnosis and most importantly helping me test my son, because I couldn't test my 2-year-old son, and Mila had been very typical at 2, so I thought every day I was going to lose both of my children and have motherhood kind of ripped from me. And that was probably the worst 3 or 4 months of my life, every single minute of every day. So thanks to Dr. Yu, he was able to find that the missing mutation that Mila had, tell me that my son was not going to die of Batten disease. And surprisingly, Spinraza had just been approved for spinal muscular atrophy, and Mila's mutation looked like it lined up with a very similar type of approach. And so fortunately, we had this option that Dr. Yu decided to not only give me an answer, but also decide that someone who had no drug development experience whatsoever to say, well, it looks possible, so until I hit a closed door, I'm not going to assume that it's not. And within a very short period of time, just over that year, Dr. Yu had designed ASOs, worked with a team of people, of which many of you guys, there are many people here who helped with this as well. And within 1 year of Mila's diagnosis, we moved to Boston, and Mila, began receiving Milacin, which was the ASO designed for her. And at some point, I want to say about a month before Milacin, Mila went off of a cliff typical of Batten disease, and we'll never know what would have happened if she would have received Milacin 1 month before. And I woke up in the morning, and I got a text. I was lying in bed with Mila, and I got an email from a dad in Italy saying, my son is the same age as Mila, and he has Batten CLN7, of which there were 20 people in the world. And this morning, I found out that my younger son has it too. And that was a hugely pivotal moment in my life, because I was sitting there just fighting so hard for my daughter, knowing that it was a long shot. And I just realized, this dad has both of his children are dying right now. I can't even imagine if my little, I'd faced that possibility that my son would be as well. And I just realized that it was bigger than Mila and that I could do everything possible, but it was probably not going to be in time, And I think Dr. Yu realized it as well. He's been an incredible teammate through all this, and he really included me as that third partner. It wasn't just industry and academics. He included me in everything that entire year, explained everything to me, brought me into the discussions with the FDA, with the companies. And really, when Mila was treated, I walked through the back hallways of Boston Children's Hospital. I think it was the first time I had a moment to breathe in a year, and I realized what a big deal this was for the community and what a big deal this was for medicine. I don't think I'd had a second to think about the fact that this was, treating an underlying genetic cause, like in her case, a single mutation, is different than treating a disease or a condition. And this was a big deal, and it could help many other people, And so Tim and I really worked hard to try to figure out, by talking to hundreds of people, literally hundreds, in every 360 degrees of this field, of how to scale this and how to turn this into something bigger. And I'm really excited that now, a few years later, that we have the N of 1 collaborative, and the whole purpose of it, and it's one piece of the puzzle. It is not alone enough to do this, but it's a place where we want all academics around the world, and we have 250 just in the last year, which is exciting, and all companies to have a neutral place where they can share learning, starting with Mila, is what did we do, how did we do it, what could we do better, and there's so much to learn, but there's so much potential, and bringing those people around the table to talk about how do you best choose a patient, how do you get your institution on board, how do you file an IND, hand the toolbox over and hand it over to hundreds of people so that they can do this as well. And very importantly, the center of this is data, and we're building a big database, and we need to make sure that industry, academics, other organizations, that everyone puts it in this place where these are not, Hail Marys. Like, if the compassionate use is great, and we used it for Mila, but we're never gonna scale that unless we pool all this knowledge and data together, and so one of the things that has come up in the last few days, which has been both disturbing, but I think confirming, is that so many parents that are fighting for their children, honestly, probably all of you that are fighting, feel this incredible nervousness around pushing the sharing of your data and your child's data. And it's something that's really important. I'm hearing from everyone that they really, really want their data, their own data, as their patient or their child's, to be shared, but they're afraid it's gonna jeopardize their treatment. And we are the third player. We are like a parallel NIH. We are funding like a huge percentage of rare disease treatments. And what I fear is that it's like, hey, patients, please come to us with all this great knowledge and information and data about your disease, and we'll take it from here. And maybe there's a seat at the table, or it's symbolic or something, but that's not right. These are smart, intelligent parents who are more motivated than anyone, and they need to be able to have a seat at the table to make sure that that doesn't get shelved, it doesn't take 10 years, that it's appropriately identifying outcome measures and endpoints. And there's a fear of like, well, I'm just a parent or a patient, and so I can't really push for that data. And I'm hearing two sides of this, so I really hope that there's a way where patients and parents who are contributing to this process are not afraid to say, and by the way, I'm giving you a grant for whatever it is, 10,000, 100,000, $1 million, and I'm working with you, and you have to share my patient's data openly, transparently with everyone. Because if this doesn't happen, we're just gonna have like thousands and thousands of awesome siloed, efforts that are never going to cross paths. So RareX is a great place to kind of allow for communication of all of this data to sit, and in conjunction with the N of 1 Collaborative, and they're working together, so.
Thank you, and data does nothing locked in a drawer anywhere. So I think that's a really critical message. And I also think you touched on, there's a little bit of fear on the family, rare disease, community side about sharing data that comes with a lot of weight about the future. Will I be able to get insurance? All these things that come to the table. Ask questions. There are experts that can answer your questions and make it much more, so you have the level of information to be comfortable sharing the data, but this is really what it's gonna take for all of us to work together. Betsy, you talk very eloquently about real-world evidence and the power of that from an early drug development perspective. So can you give us a peek behind the curtain of why building these data sets and sharing them actually help accelerate prioritization of potential candidates for meaningful therapies? So what's that journey behind the curtain in an actual drug development company?
Yeah, and so this relates also to your question, your first question, what are data and how do we define data? So there is so first of all, data are the currency of our therapeutic development. And there is a path to get to a therapy, the path that an investor looks at in deciding whether to go into a particular disease, and it's the same path then that the developer follows to get there. And it's the path from the patient has symptoms to we understand the genetic basis of that, we understand the pathophysiology, we understand the pharmacology around treatment intervention, and we understand what outcomes, surrogate and then clinically meaningful outcomes, we can measure to show an effect. And that is the path that is guiding this decision-making in early pipeline conversations at companies. And they're looking at, is that path illuminated? Do we understand that path? And when they can see it, they'll go in. And a patient community can provide insights all along the way, pieces of data all along the way to help illuminate that path. And that is going to have a meaningful impact in those early decisions that a company makes. Can we do this? Is this feasible? Do we have enough insights and evidence to feel like we can get there? And then it's going to have influence all along the development pathway.
I love the terminology, data is currency, because that's really what it is. And I think what Julia was saying is, you're the experts. So there's the expertise, there's the currency of data, and then there's the connecting the dots. And one of the terms that I've heard used, which it sort of has influenced some of the pipeline projects I've worked on, is this a druggable target? So if we're thinking about that target, to answer that question, is it druggable, which means is there a potential path to developing a therapy, means what's known about this condition. And there's nobody that knows more than the patient community. So it's the disease burden and the experience of living with the condition and the impact. And Julia, you mentioned tragically the decline with Mila in a month. So it's even understanding what's happening over the course of time, coupled with all of those charts and data and things that come back from clinic visits. So lab work and whole genome sequencing and all of those pieces come together. So it's the full story that then helps lead to investment in actually identifying a potential candidate and developing a medicine. And Julia, can you talk a little bit about working in the adjacent community? So thinking that antisense oligonucleotide might be a good modality for Batten disease, then how did you and Dr. Yu, that's hard to say, you and Dr. Yu, so I'll say Tim, how did you and Tim then bring in kind of the ASO developers to looking at Batten?
So it was mostly Tim, obviously, who did this part. He went from studying the underlying genetic causes of autism and not being a drug developer, which is not usually what an MD, PhD becomes, to learning about Batten disease, lysosomal storage around ASOs or antisense oligonucleotides, and how to, he called the 1-800 number at the FDA, which I still to this day think is hilarious. I'm just like, hey, how do I file an IND? And so he kind of learned from scratch, and he learned a lot about Batten disease. He learned a lot about ASOs from a lot of people in the industry who have been really amazing. Ionis was just, not involved, but they were very helpful, and so were others that were leaders in the field. And so I think that there was a lot of documentation during that time to make sure that all the learnings of this process and all the learnings from Mila, even just leading up to her trial and then starting with her, like seizures, for example, like everything around outcome measures of what was meaningful and measurable to us, because it was one patient, it was not a trial, it wasn't going to be an approved drug. So it was really including all the experts and learning from their data, of course. And what I was not involved in all of these behind the scenes kind of discussions around the ASOs themselves, but I do know that there is a wealth of knowledge around just use one modality, use ASOs. There's a wealth of knowledge of ASOs sitting behind closed doors in many companies. And I, as a parent, say, that's great. Like, I know you're not going to share all your data with us, but it required an enormous amount of tact and hundreds of conversations by Tim and his team to try to do their best to get knowledge without being able to see a spreadsheet or data because they didn't have access to it. And so they had to be able to take those learnings to be able to help inform how to best design, and test, Milasen. And so my hope is that there's a way, I'm still learning all of this, but I hope that there's a way that companies can find a way to share in some fashion, whether it's not going to be a spreadsheet, I realize that. But in some fashion, I hope that the N of 1 Collaborative, I bring it back for this is not a promo of the N of 1 Collaborative, this is because the whole reason we started it is that we need to be able to have neutral places where people can talk. And I spoke with Roche last week, and they're really excited about the path that Milasen is opening up, and they want to be part of it, but they're a big pharma, right? And so they can't share their actual numbers and their ASO designs, but they have a lot of knowledge, and they want to come to the table, and they want to be able to sit at the table, which is really exciting, to be honest, and symbolic. And they want to be able to share their decades of experience. That's huge, and hopefully that can translate into a more concrete kind of data sharing as opposed to just knowledge. But I think we're moving in that direction, which is exciting.
I'm very hopeful. Betsy, if you take that through a little bit further, and Julia's sharing that this data sits within industry and it's not shareable Can you explain for the group why it's not shareable?
It's a great question. Probably a lot of it is just the business constraints. I mean, it could be shareable. I'm not sure "could" is maybe the right word, but it's not because the company paid for it, and the company also, right, has good intentions. They're collecting the data because they want to provide the therapy, and they might be nervous that if they don't have control over it and they can't be sure it's done exactly the way the regulators need them to do it, and it's not going to be good enough quality, they might not get you the drug. So I do think there's also a piece of really good intention there, that they need it done well, and they need to know it's going to meet the needs so that they can deliver what they're trying to do every day, is to get you a therapy. And I do think that's a lot of where it breaks down. If a company's thinking about, well, okay, we want some observational data on a disease, we know the regulators are going to want to look at it later. We'd love to give it to a patient group, but the patient group doesn't have a robust platform. We're not sure they're going to agree to what we need. Might want it done their way. And, it just may not end up answering the questions that we need answered, right? We are a highly regulated business. It's one of the most regulated businesses there are. So it's just, there's nervousness that if it isn't going to be done the right way and the way that they need to answer the questions, then it's not going to happen. And fixing that will take everybody, including the regulators, to allow and support patient groups owning these data sets. It will take the payers agreeing to sort of buy in and use these to help with eventual market access decisions. And it's going to take the patient communities being able to and capable to put their data sets in a robust place, and to be collaborative and for industry to collaborate with them and to figure out what this can look like and find a way to kind of meet in the middle, if that makes sense.
That makes complete sense, and I think there's a whole nother session on the engagement with regulators and what that looks like early in the process and kind of the timelines and what's driven by regulatory decisions. We have a few minutes for questions if anybody wants to ask questions.
Wendy, could I just piggyback on one thing that
Yes.
she just said, because just to keep the discussion going for 1 second, is PRVs, I don't know the answer to this, but there's these incentives in place for companies to develop drugs in the orphan rare disease space. I don't know if this is the case or not, but I would hope that if there is an incentive and companies are given money, that they should be expected in the rare disease space to give back a percentage of that data. So, what you were saying makes total sense. I get it. And I keep hearing that from companies. Well, we paid for this. So we don't really, there's a value to it, even though we're throwing it in the trash or putting it on a shelf. So we're not going to share it because we paid for it. But shouldn't there be a two-way arrow here, where if a company is getting an incentive to develop a drug, that they must put a certain amount of that data back into a fully transparent database? I don't know the answer to that
Correct.
with PRVs. But. Can't hear you. Okay. Yeah. So I don't know if that's the case. I don't know the answer to that. But I really hope that if that's not the case, that that could, I don't know what part of policy or that Rare X could have, but that could be a possible place to really push that at least PRVs, that there's some minimal amount of data set that has to be returned to a neutral place.
I think that's a great idea.
You get to go do it.
Well, I mean, for everyone here, it's like, we're all leaning in to something that's new. And, Betsy just described the importance of the right data being collected and how it can be, it's like we're leaning in and trying to pioneer new approaches to things, and which is why partners and collaborators and everyone that's here and patient communities, it's like we're leaning in and doing this together. And it's amazing. It's pushing hard and, ensuring that we're all continuing to think outside the box and that we're, willing to take risks. And if something, doesn't work, then we'll go back and, kind of relook at how to approach it. So this is iterative, but with amazing, intelligent people that are leaning in to figure this out together, I think we're going to be able to go far, and that's always been the intention. There's nothing that exists that's perfect right now, but we can lean in and really try to craft what we want the future to look like and better. So, sorry. Questions?
Julia, I loved that thought, and I'm just wondering if you had a wish list, what data would you want to come back?
That's a good question. I would love, so in the small world that we're working in right now, we're talking about ASOs for no other reason than it is the modality at hand right now that's kind of programmable and could be used for an individualized medicine approach in my world that I'm working in. And preclinical data is really important. I think there's other parents out here, who have talked about how important it is to see the bad actors and to see the bad ASOs and to see the ones, that help us inform about, what not to design and help increase the capabilities of having a safe enough and efficacious enough design. And so a lot of the preclinical work and data is really important. I'd love if every company just dumped at least all of their, bad ASO designs into some kind of transparent place where everyone could learn from that. Obviously, even more would be better. Clinical is interesting. I'm learning about all this right now. This is new for me, but clinical data seems to be harder to get your hands on, and it's patients holding on to it, it's academics holding on to it. I think patients don't really know what to do. They don't know how to stand up for themselves and say, like, that's my daughter or my son's or my own data, and I want that shared, not only because they're afraid, because they literally don't know how to do it. I didn't know how to do it. I still don't really exactly know how to do it. And except for that, I raised my hand and said, hey, all of Mila's data all of it has to be in this database. And good news is that Tim Yu and his team are like 100% on board with that. And so I think the clinical data I'm learning is harder. And so I've been part of some of the discussions with academic institutions about the data, and preclinical is like, oh yeah, okay, sure, no problem. And clinical, they're like, yeah, okay, we're gonna talk to you in like a year, And so I think that making sure that, honestly, as much of the preclinical data around the drug development and all of the clinical data that comes out of that child or patient would be ideal.
Hello. Julia, I'm very inspired by your idea about data sharing. So I'm I'm a founder of a small biotech company called iAct. We've been working with Tim Yu since last year. We start with a very rare disease, so KCNQ2, and we have. I started to get more and more engaged in the rare disease space. So this is my first time coming to this meeting. So this year we have more than about seven patients working with us. So I like to share my thoughts about whether or not the company willing to share the data. So it's really about ownership of the data. So if we are working with a public company like big farmers like Pfizer or Biogen, so all these data, whether bad or not, it's great. We have big impact on their stock value, right? So they are really panicked about the bad data. But back to the patient's population, we don't really care. We're desperate, right? So we're racing for our life. So we're really trying to put everything together to help us to better optimize the efficacy, efficiency of the ASO. Or there's some ASO have very, very bad, toxicity effects. So all these things can be negative to the stock value, but it's very, very useful information for the patient community. So I have a lot of discussion with Tim. Actually, he's supposed to be here today, but he has some other issues. So he pointed me to connect with you to have more interaction with you about how to share the data, because we are not a public company, right? Maybe we need to think about out of the box. Who is willing to share, right? So even there is some personnel in the big pharma, they are really passionate about helping the patient, but they are under the organization. They have a lot of consideration, right? But for CRO company, the customer, especially those patient advocacy, they own the data. They own everything. So basically, we share everything to team, and team is sharing everything with other patients. In the beginning, I'm kind of panicked about sharing the data because we're working with other big pharmas as our customer. We're treating their data very cautiously. But I feel it's very different working with a rare patient here. So because everybody's willing to share because we are all bounded together. So I think we can have more discussion around that space, but just my thoughts about why some big pharma doesn't want to share.
Thank you for sharing, and I think you just described why RareX exists. So that's the problem we're trying to solve. And I'm not going to call out anyone by name, but in the investor community, can you imagine if the biotech of tomorrow, in their pitch on Wall Street, said, we're going to run this study and we're going to share all of the data. So no matter what happens with this trial, we're going to contribute to the future of research. Like, what a world we'd be in. And so there's a lot of complexity around all the different parts of drug development. But the more we have conversations like this, and the more we create inroads to transparently and openly putting all of the data in one safe source and protect patient privacy and all those things that are so important, the faster we'll actually be able to innovate. And for your dream, Julia, you didn't put on your wish list, but not having to have these conversations anymore because it's straightforward and drug development is easy. And I can't thank both of you enough. I'm really on the verge of tears because I'm so touched by both of you sharing your stories. And your loss is so recent that you're the badass women on the stage. I can't even imagine being able to form complete sentences. So thank you for changing the world.
My question really is, Julia, I think of Mila as more than a pioneer, but a kind of a guardian angel over all of us. And my question is, you do an amazing job about telling your story every day through pictures, through memories, and you share that with the public. And I think that my question to the scientific community is, are those stories and those narratives and those incredible moments that are shared by family members and patients just as important as those data that we collect? And how do we go about capturing that anecdotal or passionate recounts?
100%. They're more important, they're as important, and every single story that's shared in every forum motivates somebody to work harder, smarter, faster to find a treatment. So without sharing stories and without connecting everybody in this process to their purpose, we're just going to slow things down. So there's absolutely not a forum where sharing your story doesn't accelerate decision making.
Thank you. Another just add-on is, how do you integrate that and that sort of anecdotal or qualitative data into the process of data collection?
So I know they both want to answer, but I'm going to share a real life story. I was working on a rare disease for a neuromuscular condition where children lose ambulation. It's guaranteed. And my most despicable endpoint, the 6-minute walk test, is what was required by regulators. And we knew these kids were going to lose ambulation, but the 6-minute walk test was the preferred endpoint. And in talking to patients and the patients themselves, so children, none of them expressed an interest or dream or belief that they would ever walk again. What they wanted to be able to do was hold a spoon and feed themselves, play with their video games. Their needs and wants for their future were so tangible, and listening to these stories and bringing that into the conversation, I will not be bold and say we changed the primary endpoint, quite frankly, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. I think we were scared to push the envelope with regulators, which is the other problem we have to fix. but we did add secondary endpoints that actually captured what mattered to patients, and it was 100% because of the stories.
Yep. And Luke, thank you I appreciate you saying that. And I very wholeheartedly agree with you. And the reason that I do post these photos, and I have a photographer come into my house unannounced and has for 2 years and just shows up and takes photos, is because so many of my friends and family were like, Julia, you're out there fighting for Mila and no one is seeing this part of your life. And shouldn't this be weighing on the decision on top of the data and statistics and stuff? And so I let this person come in at the most difficult time in my life, which was 6 months before Mila died, and I knew that probably she wasn't going to live a lot longer. And it's been really hard for me and really therapeutic. That was initially the reason, but I will tell you that I got so much response from the community of people from the FDA and the NIH, and people regularly reach out to me and say, I look at all of your photos, and I realized then that the people that were in positions of power of making these decisions around rare disease treatments and how we're going to drastically need to move the needle, they have to see what life looks like. It's not about Mila or me or Colorado or Batten disease. It's like, this is the physical and emotional weight that goes with the decisions around the science as well. And it's part of the risk-benefit analysis, and the reason I continue doing it now, I'm not sure why anyone wants to see pictures of just me with Mila not there, but I've had a lot of people reach out and say, thank you for continuing it. And I was going to stop it when Mila died. But it's because I have to live every single day as a single mom with a 8-year-old who, had to see his sister die, as like people need to see that this is what tens of millions of people are dealing with. And so when they're making decisions on drugs and whether to shelve them or keep them or pass them, get them through the FDA or not, they have to see this is what life is like, because it is equally, I agree with you, as important as like the data. So I don't know how to capture it, except for just encourage all of you to share your own images and videos and stories.
Charlene has
Thank you all. Stuart Seidman, and I couldn't agree more. And I share my own story about my son every day, even 8+ years after he's passed away. But I have a suggestion around the data sharing, something that we did as a foundation, and many foundations, I'm sure, are funding early research. We wrote into the grant for the natural history study that we funded that data had to be shareable. And that was part of the agreement with the institution. So that doesn't solve the industry side of the equation, but certainly for patient organizations, you are funding this work, you have the power to put that into your agreements with your researchers and the institutions. Just a suggestion.
Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you. We're humbled and just honored to have you guys share our stage and be here today. And thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Betsy. And thank you, Julia. Thank you. While I